There it goes. I read this week that a survey found Easter to be the most boring holiday of the year. Can you believe that? The most boring holiday. Frederick Matthews Green wrote a rather playful piece that perhaps gets the sense of this boredom that surrounds Easter for some people. She wrote, "It's that time of year again when school children are coloring pictures of Jesus hanging on a cross, and shop owners fill their windows with gaily colored cutouts of the flogging at the pillar. In the malls, everyone's humming along with those seasonal favorites on the sound system like O Sacred Head, Now Wounded." And there is a Chipmunks version if you haven't heard it. Car dealers are promoting great big empty tomb-sized discounts on Toyotas. Yes, it's beginning to look a lot like Easter. Somehow, we just don't make the same boisterous fun of Holy Week that we do of Christmas. No one plans to have a holly jolly Easter. It's commonplace to say that Christmas is for children, but what about Easter? Is it for kids too? Sure didn't seem like that to me way back when. And I mean way back when. Compared to Christmas, Easter was boring. Chocolate bunnies, they were pretty good. But those scratchy new outfits, oh my, that was bad. The long blah, blah, blah at church. A lot of wordy, grown-up build-up leading to, it seemed, no payoff. You could always count on Christmas to change a lot of stuff, especially in my toy box. But Easter didn't change anything. In our self-centered, crassly materialistic American way of looking at things, then yeah, Easter could seem boring. We don't get the toys that we get at Christmas. There's no football. The food doesn't usually measure up to Thanksgiving, although this morning's breakfast came pretty close. There are no fireworks, not like on the 4th of July. And our cultural identification with Christian holidays is always kind of a two-edged sword. Holidays can cease to be holy days. The Easter baskets at Walmart are filled with G.I. Joes and Army characters and armored personnel carriers. It tells us how far we've gotten away from the real meaning of Easter. But even for us in the church who know what it's all about, Easter can sometimes lose something. Maybe because it's so familiar. It's not the story that loses something. It's our hearing it that loses something. The incredible, wonderfully good news of Easter can get lost on us because we've heard it so many times. I understand that the musical Godspell was written after the composer attended an Easter service and came out feeling like he'd been in a tomb himself. We need to hear the Easter story anew, as if hearing it for the very first time. John begins his telling of the story by saying, "While it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb." This one who had turned Mary's life around, the one who had filled her with hope, the one who had helped her find herself, was gone. He was dead. And the darkness hung not only over Mary, but all of Jesus' followers. In her grief, Mary went to the burial place. Like many of us, she went to the grave of her loved one to remember and to grieve. The tomb was a small cave in the rock, and a great stone had been rolled in front of it to seal it. Mary wasn't prepared for what she was about to see. The stone had been moved. It was almost more than she could bear. Jesus had already been humiliated. He had been beaten, spat upon, and finally crucified. He died an agonizing death. Mary could only watch helplessly. Most of Jesus' followers had long since gone off into hiding. And now, for one last humiliation, somebody had taken Jesus' body. She was filled with fear and terror and heart-wrenching pain. She ran to tell Peter and John. Peter, of course, had not shown his face in public since that Thursday. He had denied Jesus, and he stayed away from the cross. But Mary didn't know what else to do. She ran and told Peter and John. And they hurried back to the tomb. John ran ahead. He arrived and saw the stone had moved away. Then Peter caught up, and he went on inside. He saw the linen burial wrappings lying there. Scripture says that John saw and believed, but we're not sure what John believed. We're told that they did not yet understand the Scripture that Jesus would rise from the dead. Peter and John took in the scene, and they went back home. And by now, Mary had made her way back to the tomb. And she stayed there, and she wept. And finally, she looked into the tomb and saw two angels. They asked her, "Why are you weeping?" And she told them, "Someone has taken away her Lord, and somebody had stolen the body." Then she turned, and there was Jesus standing there, and she didn't recognize him at first. If you're not looking for something or someone, you won't see them. How many times have someone come to me and said, I walked right by you at Walmart the other day and you didn't even speak. I wasn't looking for you, so I didn't see you. Wasn't that I wouldn't have spoken if I had noticed you, but I was busy thinking about whatever it was I was there to pick up and all the other things I was picking up that I wasn't there for. Jesus asked Mary, "Why are you crying?" And she thought maybe he was the gardener. And she said, "Well, if you've taken him away, tell me where you've laid him and I'll go and get him." Mary was beside herself. She didn't know what else to do. She didn't know what else to say, so she offered to take his body by herself. Then Jesus spoke her name, Mary. Just that, Mary. Then she knew. Then she knew he was alive. It was Jesus. We've heard this so many times that it's kind of hard to catch the joy of that moment. Imagine with me for a moment. Think of a person who is closer to you than anyone else, who means more to you than anyone in the world. Imagine that loved one has died. The funeral is over. Everyone's left. You're left by yourself, left in your pain and your mourning. You go to the graveyard. You look at the name on the tombstone and tears are flowing. You're sobbing. And then you hear your name. At first you think you're hallucinating. But then you turn and then you think, well, I'm seeing things. But no, it's real. Your loved one is alive. It can't be, but there they are. What incredible joy. Can you now imagine how Mary must have felt? Sunday school teacher had just finished telling her third graders about how Jesus was crucified and placed in a tomb with a great stone sealing the opening. Then, wanting to share the excitement of the resurrection, she asked, "And what do you think Jesus' first words were when he came bursting out of that tomb alive?" Hand shot up, he was waving in the air, and finally the little girl that was attached to that arm jumped up out of her chair and said, I know. The teacher was so excited that this little girl was so excited about it. And she said, "Oh, good, tell us what it was." And she said, "He jumped out of that tomb and said, ta-da!" The resurrection is the central event of our faith. It is the ta-da experience. Because of Easter, we know that God in Jesus Christ is more powerful than death. The resurrection is not just another thing we believe as Christians. It is the very center of our faith. But we're not just talking about simply an intellectual belief that the resurrection happened. The resurrection gives us hope and power and meaning today because we experience it in our lives. It is because of Jesus' resurrection that we can experience resurrection in this life, right here and right now. So often we don't see that. So often we don't live a resurrection life. It's not surprising because those first disciples almost didn't see it either. Mary went to the tomb. She saw the stone rolled away, and she left to get Peter and John. They looked in the empty tomb, and then they went home. But then Mary went back, and she stayed for a while. She cried, she grieved, she looked in the tomb. She took a closer look, a second look, and that's when she saw the angels. She stayed around and took a closer look, and then she saw Jesus. She saw the resurrected Christ because she took a closer look. Maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe we need to take a closer look. A closer look at Christ, a closer look at our lives, and maybe we will find hope in our hopeless situations. Maybe we will see resurrection from whatever dire situation we're in. In fact, if we believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life because of some precious moments in our life, that is what we have found Jesus to be. We may believe it in our heads because we've read about it in the Bible. Or we may have been told about it by someone else. But in our stomach, in our gut, we believe it because it's what we've experienced ourselves. When have you experienced resurrection in your life? This may sound like a strange question when you think about it, but maybe we need to take a closer look. When have we been floundering without a sense of purpose? And God gave us direction. When have you been discouraged, disillusioned, and out of your despair came resurrection? I've known those who have lost a job, and it's a crushing blow. They have to make changes, sometimes hard changes, but they end up doing something that eventually brings them joy and fulfillment. After the death of losing their job, there has to come a resurrection. I've observed friends who face a life-threatening illness. And with a quiet confidence, those people somehow see past the hopelessness of the immediate situation to a far greater hope that they have in the resurrected Christ. Even in the midst of terminal illness, there can be resurrection. I've known those who've gone through the heartbreak of divorce and all the pain and chaos that brings. That hurt may last a long time, but I've watched as they begin to live again and find new life, and that is resurrection. There are those who've lost loved ones, and just as a darkness hung over Mary, they felt a kind of darkness hovering over them. A deep, almost numbing pain. Bass Mitchell is a preacher whose good friend's daughter died. It was devastating for their family. In her death, Easter took on a new importance. This friend told him, until you stare death eye to eye, Easter is just a word. It's just a nice day with bunny rabbits and eggs. But when someone precious to you dies, Easter becomes something else. It becomes everything. It becomes an anchor in a fierce storm, a rock on which you stand, a hope that raises you above despair and keeps you going. This man was a Sunday school teacher who had taught about Easter all his life. But until he had his own Good Friday, he didn't really fully understand it. Easter comes after our Good Fridays. I don't know where Good Friday would rank in a survey, but it has to be the most frequently occurring holiday. By that I mean that there's suffering everywhere. It's all around us. We all know hurt and pain and grief and disappointment. Good Fridays seem to come around every time you look up. They certainly come more than once a year. In the midst of those difficult moments, beyond those Good Fridays that we face, we can find resurrection. It doesn't always come quickly. At first, resurrection can be hard to see. Sometimes it may appear as a dim light somewhere out in the distance. But it's there. We call it that light at the end of the tunnel. But it's there. Sometimes we have to take a closer look, a second look, to see resurrection in our lives and in our world. Easter is not just a day for bunnies and eggs. If that were the case, then it would be kind of the boringest holiday. But it is in reality which brings hope and meaning to us right where we are. There's a Chinese folk tale about a farmer who had a horse. It was the only horse in the area. And because he had a horse, the farmer could plant more and could take his crops further to market. And he became very rich. But he was a good and gentle man who gave to the poor, and the people loved him. One morning the farmer woke up and found the gate to his horse paddock open, and the horse was gone. The people in the village heard about it, and they came to speak to him. "We're so sorry about your horse that brought you such wealth that ran away." The farmer answered with one word, "Maybe." 3 days later the horse returned. It brought along with it 2 stallions. Again, the people in the village came and said to the farmer, "Are you ever lucky that your horse ran away? Because now she's returned with 2 stallions. Now you have 3 horses." The farmer replied, "Maybe." The next day his son was trying to ride one of the new stallions. He fell off and broke his leg. And the people came and said, "How terrible that your son broke his leg. We're really sorry." The farmer replied, "Maybe." A few days later, the army conscription, I guess they're called conscriptions, whatever, came and took the young men of the village away, all except the farmer whose son had a broken leg. And the people came to the farm and they said, "Are you ever lucky your son broke his leg and is not able to fight in the war?" And the farmer replied, "Maybe." Events do not always have the meaning we think. Sometimes we have to wait. Sometimes we have to take a little closer look. After the crucifixion, the disciples gathered together and said, "It's all over. We have to go back to fishing." And God said, "Maybe." Then Easter came and everything changed. We may look at the situations in our life and say, resurrection couldn't happen for me. Things will never get any better. I'll never get over this. I will never win. I will be defeated. There is no hope. Well, is there any less hope than to be buried? Is there any less hope than being dead and placed in the ground? It doesn't get any more hopeless than that, does it? Yet in the middle of her deepest pain, Mary experienced her greatest joy. You might remember an earthquake that happened in Armenia several years ago. The earthquake struck a certain village, a particular village. The father raced to the school where his son was a student. There was no school building in sight. It was only a shapeless heap of rubble. Other parents had arrived, clutching their hearts and crying out the names of their lost children. But the father refused to submit to despair. He rushed to the back corner of the building and he started digging with all of his might. He had remembered that he had made a promise always to be there for his son. Well-meaning parents tried to pull this frantic father out of the rubble. "It's too late," they'd say. "They're all dead." But they couldn't convince him to stop. Even the fire chief of the village tried to pull him out of the sinking hole there, insisting that the fires and explosions were occurring everywhere and that he might be killed if he keeps doing this. But the father kept on digging. Everyone else deserted him. Finally, in the 38th hour of his digging, his body almost ready to fall from exhaustion, this determined father pulled back one more boulder and he heard a sound. It sounded like his son. He screamed out the boy's name, "Armand!" And the child responded to the sound of his name. "Dad, I told the other kids that if you were still alive, you'd save me. You did it, Dad." We may face situations that seem absolutely hopeless. We may face hurt and pain and discouragement and tragedy and even death. But we have a God who will not stop looking for us, will not stop searching and digging and working to save us. Jesus was dead and buried, but on the third day God raised him. Jesus is risen. And Jesus brings resurrection power to our lives. We only need to take a closer look. And that is the good news for this day. Amen.